alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and welcome to a 35th session of Islamic book reviews after a long hiatus. I can't recall now, actually, Omar, how long we've been offline, but it's now 3 months.
I think our last episode was in mid-August, so it's been a while. I mean, but I have relocated to a new continent since then, so not too bad.
Yes, inshallah. And also, I mean, like the internet connection will be more reliable, inshallah. Hopefully for both of us. I've also had a bit of an upgrade on my internet connection. So, and I guess Bern is announcing itself in the background for you.
Yes, so apologies. There's a church not so far from the campus, and it's been tolling since 7 o'clock. But hopefully you can still hear me. Yeah.
But khair, alhamdulillah. And inshallah, today's session, Omar, Jazakallah khairan, is back to discuss some of the latest publications in the field of Islamic studies. So Islamic book reviews is now a well-established phenomenon, inshallah.
Did you realize we recently celebrated or commemorated our 2nd anniversary?
Right.
I mean, the show, not you and I aren't married, of course.
I'm married.
As interesting as that would be, but it's been. We started on, I think, the 10th of December 2020,
right,
when the lockdown had eased somewhat.
Right.
And in some sense, I suppose this began almost as a lockdown activity, or at least a COVID activity, and alhamdulillah, it's continued.
Alhamdulillah. And I mean, in a sense, we had been discussing this for quite a while before then.
Yeah, of course.
But not to detain the audience too long on history, on the history of this sort of podcast, but we're actually discussing a book by a colleague of mine at the University of Oxford, Dr. Andrew Hammond, and his recently published monograph is entitled Late Ottoman Origins of Modern Islamic Thought, Turkish and Egyptian Thinkers on the Disruption of Islamic Knowledge, published by Cambridge University Press, I want to say last year at this point, but actually no, just in the last
very recently. I mean, the author didn't receive his copies, I mean, more than a week or two ago, I think.
Right. And of course, we thank Cambridge for giving us access to electronic copies for the purpose of this review. So a fascinating book. I've only, unfortunately, been able to read the first 4 chapters. I've just made it to chapter 5, where it starts to get somewhat interesting with respect to certain figures that I'm interested in, right? So, I mean, I'm fascinated by the 3 figures who I discussed earlier. Now it's touching on figures that I've actually worked on a bit more substantively. So, without further ado, Omar, I just want to let you take away the next 10-15 minutes, however long you wish, to give an overview of the book, and then, inshallah, we can start a broader conversation. And as always, welcome to our audience. We've actually got a couple of people giving salam, wa alaikum salam to you. And looking forward to any questions that you might have. We'll try and address these probably, towards the end of the hour, inshallah. All right.
So hopefully somewhat more than an hour, but we'll see.
And inshallah, we look forward to having a bit of a long, detailed discussion over the course of the session. I hope Andrew has had the chance to maybe sort of tune in. But I don't think we've sent you a specific link, Andrew, because we only prepared this in the last few minutes. So without further ado, Omar, please take it away, inshallah.
Sure. So this is an important contribution, no doubt. Although I do have problems with perhaps some of the ways the discussion has been framed, and also how the book has been sold, or what has been presented as the main contribution of the book. Nonetheless, very, very much an important contribution, centering on 3 important figures, 2 of them ulama, one of them what Hammond terms a devout intellectual. In the title of the book, he also uses sort of thinker to reflect this diverse status and intellectual formation of these figures, namely the last major Ottoman Sheikh al-Islam was Mustafa Sabri, often said to be the last Sheikh al-Islam, but that's not in fact correct. And a figure who dies in 1954, I should say, and a figure who serves as his deputy of education, Zahid al-Kawthari, who dies in 1952. Although his name is transliterated throughout the book as, I don't have Turkish, but Kawthari, or however it's pronounced. I should apologize because I do have a tendency to Arabize when I vocalize these things. And why?
Sorry, for what it's worth, it's pronounced Kevseri. So
Kevseri,
because
okay.
the well becomes a the sound, so Kevseri.
Yes, this reminds me in Jonathan Brown's misquoting Muhammad ﷺ book, which is cited because it's one of the few English language discussions of Kawthari. He refers, or he characterizes Kawthari's Arabic accent as labial, which reflects the way with this kind of, anyway, the way that the vowels are kind of enunciated and the consonants are enunciated in Arabic. Anyway, which I agree with. Why does he choose to transliterate it following the Turkish? Well, because in one of Kawthari's autobiographical writings, Irgham al-Murid, if I'm not mistaken, he in fact uses a sin instead of a tha. So in his own Arabic writing, and Kawthari wrote almost exclusively in Arabic, certainly later on in his career, he makes this, or he uses this spelling. So Kawthari and Mehmet Akif Ersoy, who dies in 1936, with the surname law in 1934, he has to take on the surname Ersoy, so he's usually referred to as Mehmet Akif, or shorthand just Akif. Mostly remembered as a poet, and I must admit somewhat less interesting to me because, as Hammond says at some point later on in the book, when he discusses the scholarship, actually perhaps it's in chapter 2, which presents the intellectual profiles of these scholars, devout intellectuals and AlManar respectively. Kawthari is, or the discussion of Kawthari has been somewhat siloed. He's reasonably well known to Islamicists, but it has hardly been touched by Middle Easternists. So the book does bridge some interesting disciplinary boundaries, and the bibliography is interesting. He draws very heavily on Turkish scholarship, which is a very really valuable service to those like me who do not work on late Ottoman intellectuals, or at least do not read Turkish. So that's interesting. The book is divided into an introduction, which is really the first chapter, and so 6 chapters in total, if I remember rightly. The first chapter discusses the historiography of the late Ottoman intellectual tradition and also raises some broader methodological questions, and discusses, the methodological framing of the book. It's kind of quite thesis-y, the first chapter, and I found it quite less totally structured, shall we say, than the other chapters, but nonetheless useful. The second chapter presents the intellectual profiles of these figures, drawing on both the biographical and hagiographical literature they have generated, including, of course, many works in Turkish and also Arabic in the case of Sabri and Kawthari. Both of, well, at least Sabri received a comprehensive Arabic biography in Arabic before he did so in Turkish in the work of the Saudi scholar Mufarrih al-Qawsi, whose book on Sabri I think was published in 1997, if I remember rightly. And the third chapter explores in particular Sabri and Mehmet Akif and their reception of Muhammad Abdu, among other subjects. The fourth chapter focuses on Kawthari and Salafism, including a debate on the use of this term and a kind of genealogy, intellectually and historically, of this term. We've, of course, discussed the debate between Lozier and Griffel in previous episodes, so I'll avoid kind of rehearsing it again. And then a fifth chapter which explores their views of the state and politics. And the sixth chapter, which discusses their afterlives, what relationship they had with Islamist thought within Turkey and beyond Turkey. Qutb is important in this discussion, and so on. So this gives you a very broad overview of the book, but to say something about their biographies, which occupy chapter 2, their profiles are somewhat different. Akif is born in 1873 in the Fatih district of Istanbul to an Albanian father and a mother of Uzbek origin. His family name is actually Raghif, like a loaf of bread, but it's misheard by the official who's recording his name, so it becomes transformed to Akif. Anyway, he had initially, at least, the education one would expect for an aspiring bureaucrat in the late Ottoman Empire, but he had to cut this short. His madrasa teacher father, who did give him some religious education, died, and also the family house burned down, so he was forced to study veterinary science, and he actually worked for 20 years until 1913 in the animal husbandry bureaucracy, and this enabled him to travel quite far and wide in the empire. He joins the CUP, Committee for Union Progress, in 1908 and teaches Ottoman literature at the Dar al-Funun, but he's expelled from his post in 1913 for his criticism of the CUP conduct of the Balkan Wars. In 2 previous episodes, we discussed quite extensively the early history of the Turkish Republic. Our episodes on Phil Dorrell's book and on Sevgi Adat's book on unveiling in the Turkish context and its history. But anyway, and during the war years, he is involved with the Tashkila Makhsusa, which is a very secretive kind of intelligence bureau, and is involved in enticing Muslims fighting for the Entente powers to join the war effort, actually, against the Entente. He undertakes a number of interesting political operations, including visits to the Arabian Peninsula to secure the support of El Saud and the Rashidis against Sharif Hussein, who's being seduced, if you like, by the British. And he undertakes a number of other missions. He slips away to Ankara during the independence struggle in the early 1920s. And in 1923, he, by then, I think it's become obvious when the Republic is established and so on, what direction the wind is blowing. So he resigns his post in the National Assembly in 1923, and he goes into a series of self-imposed exiles, the longest and final one lasting from 1925 to 1936. He's invited by the princeling Abbas Hilmi of Egypt to reside in his state in Hilwan. So he spends the last decade or so of his life in Egypt, enjoying the patronage of Abbas. And shortly before departing, he accepts, and this is one of the major aspects of his career, he accepts a commission to translate the Quran into Turkish. But by 1931, he's concluded that this would be the crowning element of the Turkish Republic's policy of religious Turkification. So he doesn't surrender the manuscript. He returns in the final months of his life in 1936 and dies on December 27th. So his final illness and death take place in Turkey. But he is nonetheless an important figure among these Ottoman emigres in Egypt. So that's a very brief sketch of so he's remembered primarily as a poet, and the works, his poetic corpus is drawn on, including the Safahat. And in Hammond's book, there are some wonderful translations of his poetry, some of which has been translated into Arabic, but Akif is not well known at all in the Arab world, notwithstanding that fact. So his poetic corpus, and also importantly, another major source for his intellectual career in this book, is his post and his contributions to the important modernist periodical, modeled very much on AlManar, which Akif edited from 1908 to 25, or was published from 1908 to 25. Initially known under the title Sirat al-Mustaqim, and then in March of 1912 becoming Sabil al-Rashad. Sabri, on the other hand, born in 1869 to devout Anatolian parents in Tokat, then moving for Kayseri for his religious education, and finally making it to Istanbul right at the end of the 19th century, coming under the patronage of Ahmed Abbas Effendi, who occupies the post, I understand, at Kothari Wood sometime later as an educational assistant for the Sheikh al-Islam. Anyway, in 1897, he's invited to attend this very prestigious series of lectures at which the Sultan attends in person, an institution that goes back some centuries. And in 1900, he impresses Abdul Hamid II with a treatise on the subject of property obtained through false oaths. So in 1900, he's appointed as Yildiz Palace librarian and becomes secretary to the Sultan's office. 1905, he's appointed to a committee overseeing publications on Islam in the empire, of course, censorship policy and so on. Very important part of the empire's propagandistic activities, you could say, and so soft power. And he is not unsympathetic to the Young Turks initially in 1908. And from 1908 to 1912, he is editor of a major publication representing an important association of ulama known as Bayan al-Haq. It's more conservative than, it's not a modernist periodical. So he uses his first editorial to praise reason and science and progress, to emphasize that Islam is not inimical to any of these things, and to call for justice and condemn tyranny and so on. But he does fall out of love with the Young Turks, and in 1912 goes around Anatolia denouncing them as atheistic traitors. Pardon me. They, of course, return the favor, and when they come back into power in 1913, they hunt him down. He escapes through the window of his house, and through the good offices of a Christian friend of his in the Fanar district is able to escape. He flees, he goes to Paris, and then settles in Bucharest for a while before in 1918 he's arrested and returned to Turkey. And then he flees, unlike Akif, who left to Ankara in 1922. Sabri flees to Alexandria initially, and he wanders for some years. He has stints in Medina, Romania, and Lebanon, and in 1927 settles in Greek Thrace, where he, until between 27 and 30, he edits a paper with his son. The Greek prime minister comes under some diplomatic pressure from Turkey to do something about this troublesome cleric. So anyway, from 27 to 32, he's in Greek exile, if you like, having been made to relocate within the country. And in 1932, he's very pleased to accept the visa offered by the Egyptian ambassadors. So for the last More than 2 decades of his career, 1932 until 1954, he's in Egypt. And he initially accepts a post with the Wazarat al-Awqaf to oversee mosque improvement. And his flat in Heliopolis becomes a major kind of, he hosts a salon basically. And he, unlike his initial departure for Egypt in 1922, he's in Egypt in 1922, and then he finally settles there in 1932. In 1922, he receives the cold shoulder because he's seen as a collaborator with the imperialists and the colonialists, because he'd urged the Sultan Mehmed VI, whose inner circle he belonged to accept the terms of the Treaty of Sèvres. And in later years, he would say that, in fact, what happened to Turkey was much worse than the Allied occupation. It would be better to have Greeks ruling over Anatolia than secularist, laicist republicans, anyway. So he spends a number of years in Egypt, and perhaps we can discuss the works he writes. The major work discussed in this book is his magnum opus, finally completed and published in 1949, موقف العقل والعلم والعالم من رب العالمين وعباده المرسلين, a work that Hammond cites Booty as calling, praising to the skies. His student Abu Ghudda, who died in 97, this isn't mentioned in the book, called it actually the greatest work of the century, which is interesting. And Hammond summarizes it as a work that criticizes, it sort of surveys modern knowledge, it criticizes European skepticism and empirical tendencies in European philosophy and materialism. It defends the validity and usefulness of Kalam and so on. But he has other important works. Unlike Kothari, who wrote almost exclusively in Arabic, and Akif, who wrote almost, as far as I know, in Turkish, Ottoman Turkish. Sabri, from the period about 1922 to 1924, switches from writing in Turkish to writing in Arabic. So, in his Egyptian exile in 1932, he writes an important essay on the translation of the Quran, في مسألة ترجمة القرآن. 1933, he writes a very important work, which is very critical of Muhammad Abdu, which we will get onto when we discuss the third chapter, which is موقف البشر تحت سلطان القدر. Also very important because Kothari discusses it too. And his opus in 1939, I think it's 1936, if I'm not mistaken, when he writes قولي في المرأة, which is a very short work of maybe 24 pages or 3 pages or so. Anyway, so that's a very brief overview of Akif and Sabri. So finally, Kothari, Osama, before we return to discuss this more, and hopefully we will unpack each of the chapters in greater detail. I've been discussing mostly chapter 2 so far. Kothari is born in northwestern Anatolia in 1879, I think. And he's of Circassian background. And even in later life, when he's in his Egyptian exile, he maintains links with the Circassian community. This is very important to him and is even criticized by others for his partisanship for the Circassians. Kothari is most well known to Islamicists, as I said. He also ends up teaching in the Fatih Madrasa, the most prestigious site for education in the Ottoman Empire in this period, and attempts to resist CUP efforts to reformulate the syllabus there. And he also angers them in a number of respects. Like Sabri, he makes his escape. So in 1919, he's Sabri's educational assistant. So he's attached to the office of the Sheikh al-Islam, although the next Sheikh al-Islam to succeed Sabri basically kicks him out. And in 1922, he, like Sabri, slips away from Turkey and is, unlike Sabri, quite warmly received in Alexandria and then Egypt. And he has a halqa, the Abu Dhahab mosque, And he lives in penury for some time, working a lot with the manuscripts of the Zahiriya and Dar al-Kutub libraries. And he also spends a year in Damascus, continues to acquire ijazas and so on. Fortunately, he's discussed his educational formation extensively in the autobiographical writings, Righam al-Murid and Tahrir al-Wajiz, which discusses his 24 teachers, and among whom Sufis figure very prominently. And so he's in Egypt. He eventually gets a post curiously translating Ottoman diplomatic documents with the Dar al-Mahfudat, but continues to be quite a prominent figure in intellectual life. He mixes extensively with important intellectuals and Azharis. Both Sabri and Kawthari mix very intensively with Azharis during their Egyptian exile. And there's also an emigre Turkish community, some of whom end up actually returning to Turkey, whom they also influence. So, I mean, the major works discussed in this book, I mean, Kawthari is really, to many of us, most well-known, and as discussed in Ahmed Shamsi's second book, which we had an episode on. Kawthari is mostly remembered as an editor. He authored, I think, 21 works before his Egyptian exile, most of which are lost to us. And he wrote almost exclusively in Arabic. And certainly when he was in Egypt, he was writing pretty much entirely in Arabic. And his maqalat were published in 1953, the year after his death. It doesn't collect all of his articles, and there is one appendix going through all of Kawthari's articles and mentioning which of them features in the published maqalat. And he had many friends and associates, such as Muhammad Amin al-Khanji, the famous publisher in Egypt. And in 1997, there was an important volume, Muqaddimat al-Kawthari, where his introduction to 57 of his editions of important Islamic texts are collected together. And this kind of really gives you a sense of his program, his religious program, what it is exactly. Like Sabri, perhaps to an even greater extent than Sabri, is characterized, using Jonathan Brown's terminology, as a late Sunni traditionalist. He was engaged in all kinds of polemical battles in Egypt, and posthumously, and people are criticizing his after his death, particularly al-Albani, but he is critical of figures like Muhyiddin al-Khatib, who dies in 1969, Muhammad Bahjat al-Baytar, dies in 1976, sort of Salafi in some sense, and we'll have to unpack what that means in this period, and is very much a partisan of the Hanafi madhab and late classical Sunnism, and defends Abu Hanifa and Hanafism in a series of publications, including Ta'nib al-Khatib, his criticism of, I think, volume 13 of al-Khatib al-Baghdadi's History of Baghdad, which discusses around 150 reports critical of Abu Hanifa, accusing him of being a murji and believing in Khalq al-Quran and so on. And also he wrote a work against Ibn Abi Shayba's chapter criticizing Abu Hanifa in his Musannaf, around 125 narrations, and Kawthari defends him in various ways we can perhaps get into. And probably to round that off, I should say that al-Albani, in his introduction to Ibn Abi al-Izz al-Hanafi's commentary on Tahawi's Creed, calls him a muta'assib Hanafi, or Hanafi muta'assib, and a Jahmi. So he's kind of, even after his death, he was not spared this kind of polemic. But hopefully that gives you a broad idea of the lives of these figures and a sense of their intellectual agendas and whom they're wrestling with. And it's an important book for sure. And yeah.
Have we? I feel as though we've only gone through about half of the book so far.
Even less. I mean, I've spoken mostly about chapter 2, and I've gone into some detail about it.
Right. So, I mean, I'm happy for you to sort of, because you were very interested in perhaps having a bit of a longer session today. Yeah. So I'm more than happy for you to continue, or if you like, we can start
Sure.
a bit of a discussion. As I've mentioned, I haven't done chapters 5 and 6. I've started chapter 5, but I haven't gotten to 6 yet.
So perhaps then I could say chapter 1, I said, is somewhat more dissertation-ish and less structured than the other chapters. He discusses, the thesis of decline and Analytic's notion of the triumph of fanaticism, critiqued by Khalid al-Ruwayhib. He also, it's quite a sprawling chapter. So it's difficult to summarize the over contribution of it. It's easier to mention discrete points, which I'm happy to do, of course. But chapter 3, which says something of especially Aqif and Sabri's reception of Abdu. Aqif was really a modernist, and in the late Ottoman period, the modernist voice among the various competing intellectual streams was, among the most prominent. And he translates several of Abdu's books and many of his articles, and also those by, figures like Muhammad Farid Wajdi, who was connected to Abdu's circle. So this, if you like, Sabil al-Rashad, as it's later known, is really the mouthpiece of late Ottoman Islamic modernism. Sabri's views on Abdu shift noticeably. Now, it's already evident when he's editing Bayan al-Haq in 1908 that the views clearly diverge, but he's not very familiar with Abdu's work. So, his views, whether it's on issues like riba, naziri, and monetary interest, polygyny, photography, all diverge sharply from views that are well known as belong to Abdu. But in his initial treatment, he regards him favorably. He calls him a mujaddid in some of his early work. And it's not really, in later life, he becomes intensely critical of Abdu. So it's really quite a transition as he comes to be more familiar with his corpus and his legacy. And it's really during his exile in the interwar period where he comes to be aware of Abdu really through the writings of Tatar intellectual and modernist Musa Jarullah Bigiev, who dies in 1949 and ends up actually dying in Egypt and spends 5 years or so in Egypt. Bigiev writes a book whose title translates as Proofs of Allah's Mercy, where he argues for some kind of universal salvation based on works. It's a kind of pluralistic soteriology drawn on Ibn Arabi. I don't think this is mentioned in the book, but also on Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas about Fana and Nar. This has been discussed in the secondary scholarship. And he argues that Ibn Arabi is a pluralist in soteriological terms, and so on and so forth. So Sabri is intensely critical of this work. He argues that, well, actually, Ibn Arabi is far more complicated and contradictory even is Futuhat al-Makkiyah, and he can be interpreted in many ways, which should point to Gregory Lipton's book on Ibn al-Arabi as really contesting this and the perennialist also interpretations of Ibn al-Arabi. For example, one ruler of a particular Anatolian principality, we have this correspondence, and he urged this ruler whose name escapes me, is not well known to history, it's pre-Ottoman Anatolia. He urges him to apply rigorously the shurut al-dhimma, the kind of discriminatory stipulations to particularly the Christian population of Anatolia, though part of it ruled by this person. Anyway, all kinds of other discussions we can have about the category of religion and how it influences how, the translation of words in Ibn Arabi's corpus like Mu'taqad being translated as a religion, which is somewhat misleading and has given rise to, at least according to Lipton, many misunderstandings. Anyway, so he's very critical of this.
Just a clarification. So Lipton is basically saying that is disagreeing with what would be Mustafa Sabri's interpretation of Ibn Arabi.
No, he's disagreeing with Ibn Arabi as a pluralist, religious pluralist.
Okay. Right.
And Sabri is saying, well, he's not a pluralist, but also his work is contradictory and complicated. But in any case, he strongly takes issue with Bigiev. And I mean, later, by this point in his life, and by the 30s, his final Egyptian exile, he basically holds Abdu responsible for he says the trends that have now prevailed in Turkey as a result of, Republican laicism, also coming to dominate in Egypt through propaganda rather than coercion. So he's intensely critical of Abdu. He refers to his famous debate with Farah Antoun, and he holds Abdu responsible for not really taking the debate seriously, in the sense that, he concedes too much, Sabri thinks, to Farah Antoun. The debate is broadly about, Ibn Rushd and secularism and reason and religion and so on. He thinks implicitly Abdu concedes the point that, you cannot prove the existence of God and prophecy through rational means. Implicitly, he suggests Abdu accepts this point, and he refers to him as a Raibi, or skeptic, and is aware of Cromer's view that Abdu was an agnostic. Nonetheless, he says that he doesn't defend belief in, and it's an important work he writes in 1943, القول الفصل في الذين يؤمنون بالغيب والذين لا يؤمنون. I guess is, I think, in the title, on belief in the kind of ghaibi elements of religion. He thinks Abdu hasn't really done enough to defend these, and also that he adopts apparent views on issues like, I think he accuses him of denying the resurrection and belief in jinn and angels and so on. And so he is intensely critical of Abdu at this period. And there is also further discussion in chapter 3 of Akif's activities before he leaves for Egypt in 1923. He translates, really on behalf of the Republican government, an important treatise by al-Aziz Jawish, who actually teaches Arabic at New College, Oxford, between 1902 and 1906. And then writes his book Al-Islam Din al-Fitra wal-Hurriya, or Din al-Hurriya wal-Fitra, because of the kind of very prejudiced anti-Muslim views of the people he meets at Oxford, funnily enough. And he's an important public intellectual. He's actually expelled from Egypt to Istanbul in 1912 for his pro-Ottoman agitation. And he's this sort of kind of pan-Islamist figure, if you like. Anyway, in 1818, the English civil servant Arthur Boutwood, B-O-U-T, Wood, writes a letter. So in 1818, he writes a letter which the genesis of is somewhat mysterious, Hammond tells us. But he seems to have had some kind of connections with intelligence. But it's addressed to the Mashayikha, this official, the Shaykh al-Islam's office, effectively, and they believe it to come from, or at least on behalf of, the Archbishop of Canterbury, asking some questions about Islam and how it deals with the problems of the present world, including economic problems. And Hammond suggests that this has something to do with the British fear of the influence of Bolshevism in the Muslim world. So Hammond writes that this work, responding to this letter, is published some years later in 1923 by Jawish writes it. It's praised in the journal Sabil al-Rashad as this great modern manifesto of Islam. And Akif's job is to translate it into Turkish, which he does, because the Republican government is trying to burnish its religious credentials, if you like. So they undertake this project. Jawish falls out of favor, however, with the Republican government. In 1923, he leaves for Egypt. A series of 2 long conversations with Ataturk convince him that things are not headed in a very salutary direction. So he leaves, as does, for his final exile, 1925, Ersoy. That, by the way, that's referred to as the Anglican Church incident. This episode is referred to by other intellectuals and Muslim figures such as Nursi. Anyway, That's chapter 3. Chapter 4, of course, is a subject very dear to my heart. There's some interesting discussion of the history of the use of the term Salafism and Salafiyya, but especially al-Albani and this kind of prehistory before al-Albani. But it explores Kawthari's work as an editor, as a polemicist. I already discussed his writings against Muhibbuddin al-Khatib, Muhammad Bashar al-Bitar, and also the librarian of the Haram, Abdurrahman al-Muallimi al-Yemeni, who writes an important, I think published in 1966 with al-Albani's preface, At-Tankil. It's basically a refutation of Kawthari, and it talks about al-Khatib al-Baghdadi and so on. I mean, Kawthari could get very dirty, with his people he didn't like, people who he felt were critical of those things did to him. So he implies that al-Khatib al-Baghdadi was a pederast, basically. Well, more than implies, I should say. But so, I mean, his tone is very interesting. But, he was nonetheless a fascinating figure. And of course, from especially, 1920s to the end of his career, he's known for his polemics against both modernist and purist Salafis, to use this kind of popular typology. And he regarded the purist Salafis actually as the greater threat because their critique of this post-classical Islamic tradition is rooted much more firmly within the tradition, he felt. And his exercises as an editor were not ivory tower endeavors. So he publishes, I think in 1927, Ibn al-Jawzi's Dafa Shubhat al-Tashbih bi'akaf al-Tanzih. This kind of Ibn al-Jawzi was a very idiosyncratic Hanbali, so it's written against other Hanbalis who he believes have maligned the school by associating it with anthropomorphic tendencies or tajseem. And in 1929, he publishes the infamous Bayan Zaghal al-Ilm, to which he Dhahabi's Bayan Zaghal al-Ilm, to which he appends the Nasiha Dhahabiyya. And I know, Osama, this is a subject you've looked at length, so perhaps you'd like to say something about that.
Sure, inshallah. I actually just wanted to ask earlier, you just mentioned scurrilous accusations that he would level at certain people sometimes. And does Andrew deal with that accusation against al-Khatib al-Baghdadi?
No, he doesn't. Oh. He doesn't actually mention it.
Is it mentioned anywhere in the secular literature? I'm not aware.
I mean,
yeah, okay.
No, I don't think it's not in English at least, but it's pretty well known, and
Yeah, a Kawthari or a Kawthari, as it were. I mean, the only people I know who've written on him in the secondary literature are Jonathan Brown, Ahmed Shamsi, and now Andrew.
Yeah, so and they're both, of course, referred to in this book. Yes, Hammond does an excellent job with the secondary literature. Again, I'm very grateful for how extensively he engages with the Turkish literature, which is very extensive on Ersoy and on Akif. Why? Because Akif is kind of, the laicists don't really like him, but he's seen, especially in the AKP era, as this kind of more authentic icon of Turkish modernity. Of course, 1921, a poem of his becomes the Turkish national anthem, the Independence March. So he's remembered again primarily as a poet. And on the 50th anniversary of his death in 1986, the Ministry of Education has some activities to commemorate his contributions. But the Turkish historiography of this period has been for very long hostage to not only kind of nationalist tendencies, but even very laicist ones. So he says, despite the importance of all of these figures for late Ottoman intellectual history, it's not until, I think, 97, if I'm not mistaken, that Ersoy figures in the Turkish Encyclopedia of Islam, that he gets an entry. And not until the 2000s that Sabri and Kawthari do. Although, there was awareness, certainly of Akif, but Niyazi Berkez in his development of secularism in Turkey, we refer to it in the Savgi Adak book quite extensively. along with Bernard Lewis. For decades, those two books published in, I think, 60 and 64 were kind of the foundations of the field. And they're very kind of Manichaean in terms of how they portray the struggle between figures like Sabri or sympathetic to Sabri and Ataturk.
I mean, anyone's done a kind of specific retrospective on those two books?
Well, not directly, but I mentioned in that episode Carter von Findley's book, the title of which I forget, but this is kind of the next. It's kind of superseded these works in many ways. Islam, State and Nation, something like this, I forget. And he's a wonderful historian. And what Carter von Findley really emphasizes is, and it comes through in this book, although I don't think he refers to Findley. I mean, what happens is, in this period Hammond describes, especially, say 1918 to 22, all of these late Ottoman intellectual tendencies, really the competition intensifies, and one particular vision of modernity triumphs over another. So, Kawthari and Sabri, of course, they're intensely critical of different aspects of European thought and culture, but they're not anti-modern in the sense that they believe, let's do away with, I don't know, steam trains and this kind of thing. No, actually, they have their own very distinctive vision of modernity, but it is one wedded to their identity as Muslims and their religion as Muslims. So that's what happens in that context. Okay. So Kawthari is,
Just if I can interject on that particular point, I mean, there is a strain of sort of traditionalism that has emerged in the latter part of the 20th century, which has been quite anti-technological, hasn't? I mean, I'm thinking about certain types of perennialist tendencies seem to hew in that direction.
But I mean, in some sense, it's a sign of the. I mean, everyone had deeply internalized the need for various kinds of reform, whether bureaucratic or technological. I mean, very few people were contesting. You do find, I think, the late Ruth Peters has an article on, a very old article on people discussing certain technological innovations like the train and being critical of them. But these were very, very marginal indeed. I mean, not to say there weren't criticisms in the 18th century, but by the 20th century, no one was towing this line anymore. Very, very few people were towing this line anymore. And it had always been the case, Ottomanists will say, that those in elite positions in the Ilmiya and the Ottoman learned hierarchy had always supported these kinds of reforms from the outset, and unsurprisingly.
Does Lausière not give examples of some chap who insisted that the world was flat? I can't remember now in Saudi Arabia.
Well, he does refer to, and it's discussed by King Abdulaziz Rahimullah's Minister of Education, Hafid Wahba, in his memoirs, Arabian Days. So it's written in English and then he writes it again in Arabic. And the interesting difference is he doesn't actually name the guy who says this in the Arabic version of the text, but in Arabian Days, he names him as Abdullah al-Bulayhid, who is a Qadi and Mufti. And actually, or even in the Najdi context, he says Bulayhid is like one of the very few people who defends the Earth's flatness. Hafid Wahba brings out the recently published, I think 1926 it came out, published in Egypt. I think Ahmed al-Shamsi refers to this kind of indirectly, perhaps, in his second book, as far as I remember. But anyway, Ibn Taymiyyah's Risala al-Arshi is first published in 1926 by al-Matba' al-Muniriyya in Egypt as an independent treatise where he explicitly affirms the roundness of the earth. So Hafid Wahba confronts Abdullah bin Bulayhid by saying, look, this guy you claim to follow says the earth is round, what do you make of that? But he has no, by the way, I should note, in that book, Hafid Wahba, he really has no personal hostility at all towards Abdullah bin Bulayhid. Later on in the work, he says that they travel with each other, and Bulayhid is very conscientious and looks after him, and when he's ill, he gives him medicine and so on. Right. And he said, Hafid Wahba at his credit says very explicitly, look, these people, they're not, this is, for them, it's purely, if you like, ghira for their religion that makes them angry or sad or happy about anything. It's not, there's no personal element at all. Right. And he says this about Bulayhid explicitly. So, Anyway, but and anyway, I'm writing actually a paper on this Saudi debate that continues to stay in some, but to avoid getting too off topic.
Yeah, sorry, just curious, what period would this be?
1920s. So he's the Minister of Education for Abdulaziz. As you know, Abdulaziz had to recruit many other Arabs, especially Egyptians and Syrians, into his bureaucracy. I think he's Minister of Education from like 1927 to 29 or something like this. And this is when he's engaging with debates on kind of conservative Najdi traditionalists about modern technology. So again, these debates that were settled long ago in the Ottoman context, in Najd, which is something of a backwater technologically, people are encountering the wireless and, they're convinced that magic and jinn is involved and so on. It's a really interesting discussion. I mean,
incidentally, just I wanted to bring in a comment from one of our viewers, Dr. Stephen Connolly. I think he's at Imperial College, just commenting that in his view, technological related issues were a sideshow in these developments. But
cool.
I mean, perhaps.
So he has an earlier comment. I can see Circassians weren't they wiped out during the Soviet era? I mean, they weren't eliminated, so they still exist. And there are large populations of them still in Turkey and so on. I mean, I think the major problems in terms of resettlement and migration and genocide happened during the late Russian Empire, like mid to late 19th century, even more so than in the Soviet period. And that's when you have large waves of migration to what became Turkey. To Anatolia, and there is still population. I mean, some of them can still speak the language. Others I've met can't speak the language, but still identify very strongly as Circassian, which is really interesting. They've transmitted it for generations, and they've lost the language, but this identity is still very important to them.
I'm conscious of a little conscious of time. I mean, you've basically so far covered chapters 1 to 4, I want to say.
Well, I've said very little about chapter 1. I've discussed 2 extensively,
yes.
3 in some depth, 4, a bit about 4, but I should say more about Kawthari. I mean, the reason I mentioned the Bayan Zaghl al-Ilm of al-Dhahabi, student of Ibn Taymiyyah, which is also critical of Ibn Taymiyyah, especially the so-called Nasiha al-Dhahabiyya, because you wrote your undergraduate dissertation on this, and you're publishing it, I believe, as an article.
Yes, I have.
It's a long work
before I publish it.
Yeah.
Yes, inshallah. I mean, I'm planning to submit it. Hopefully.
And would you care to summarize in brief your findings on these 2 works attributed to Dhahabi, including the very controversial Nasiha al-Dhahabiyya, which Hammond points out Katerina Bori accepts the authenticity of?
So sure, and that's really interesting. I mean, Katerina Bori, she's now cemented that sort of position in EI3, so it's in the Encyclopedia of Islam. I want to say under the entry for al-Dhahabi. I am very skeptical about the Nasiha al-Dhahabiyya's kind of attribution to al-Dhahabi. Bayan Zaghl al-Ilm, which is somewhat critical of Ibn Taymiyyah, names him. It has been established, I think, quite, indisputably to be authentically attributable to al-Dhahabi. We have, I think, an autographed manuscript from Ala'i, meaning like transmitted to a student or a student of. It might have a chain. That one intermediary between himself and al-Dhahabi, but he was a student of al-Dhahabi as well. But that text is nowhere near as problematic, so to speak, as. There aren't any major inconsistencies, I think, with Dhahabi's wider oeuvre and the Bayan Zaghl al-Ilm, whereas the Nasiha al-Dhahabiyya just completely, it doesn't make any sense to attribute it to Dhahabi.
Could you explain in a sentence for our listeners?
Sure. So the Nasiha al-Dhahabiyya, it's an entertaining read actually, because it's just a bit out there, as it were. So it's basically purports to be a letter written by al-Dhahabi. That's the claim now that al-Kawthari really introduces. It's a letter written by someone ostensibly to Ibn Taymiyyah. Now, neither Ibn Taymiyyah nor al-Dhahabi are explicitly mentioned in the letter, but the course of the letter is a sort of caustic attack against a person whom it's addressed to. But ironically, it's kind of, it's somewhat schizophrenic. It seems to say that, I'm a dear and loving friend, and then it launches into a really unremitting tirade, so to speak, and suggests that this person is like a donkey or more of a disbeliever than Fir'aun, and all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff.
And what did you find? I can't remember quite about the attribution and its origin and this kind of thing.
I mean, so the attribution, as far as I can tell, and to be honest, I'm going to have to sort of dig up some of my own sort of notes on this. But as far as I can tell, no one ever. I mean, the manuscript seems to have kind of appeared in the middle, in the early 20th century. Kebseri kind of seizes upon it and says, this is a Dhahabi's, and he's writing about Ibn Taymiyyah. And then he, in my view, kind of really tenuously tries to find references to works by Dhahabi where he's critical of Ibn Taymiyyah in sort of Sakhawi's writings. And
surprise.
and I mean, it's extremely tenuous. And it's, it's kind of motivated thinking by those who, in my view, motivated thinking by those who sort of have come to accept it within the Islamic tradition. Of course, outside the Islamic tradition, working within Western academia, I think, I mean, it's interesting. Dhahabi has a nuanced relationship with Ibn Taymiyyah. He's not a partisan, very clearly. But he also presents him, he's written multiple biographies of him, and Katerina Bori is the translator. She found and translated one of the longest, the so-called Nubdha. And it illustrates that, he's someone who was at times critical of Ibn Taymiyyah, but at the same time he does express...
But theologically very much a traditionalist. I mean...
Theologically, I mean...
His work al-Ulul al-Ali al-Ghaffar is I mean, not something that Kawthari would have liked very much. I mean, Kawthari is interesting in terms of the choices of works he edits. Like, he edits Ibn Qutayba's not Ta'wil al-Mukhtalaf al-Hadith, al-Ikhtilaf fi al-Lafz, I think, wa-Rad al-Jahmiyyah. But anyway, I should say something about the label Salafism to continue my summary of chapter 4.
No problem.
I haven't been very analytical so far, so perhaps later on we can be more analytical. But anyway,
I wanted to ask you if you could. I mean, you said that we've already discussed the Henri Lauzière and Frank Griffel debate, but I mean, if you just for those who have no
I mean, I can. So let me say what exactly Hammond contributes to the history of this term. Or the use of this term. So he nuances Lauzière's account. What does he say? Already in the 19th century, you find, for example, in the Mufassir Shihab ad-Din al-Alusi's Ghara'ib al-Iqtirab, his travelogue, he discusses defending Ibn Taymiyyah to the Ottoman Shaykh al-Islam Arif Hikmat, and he uses this term Salafiyun. His son Nu'man Khairuddin then writes this Jala al-Aynain fi Muhakamat al-Ahmadain, which is a defense of Ibn Taymiyyah, really. And in correspondence between Mahmoud Shukri al-Alusi, who was the nephew of Nu'man Khairuddin, who dies in 1899, the correspondence between him and Jamal ad-Din al-Qasimi, they also use this, and this correspondence, between 1908 and 1913 or so, 1912. They discuss this. They use the term Salafi to refer to both early Muslims and figures like Ibn Taymiyyah, and also to a set of particular legal and theological views. And the term continues to be used here and there, including for the Matba' Salafiyya, this press established by Muhammad al-Khatib, who says he takes the title from or is inspired by the Tahir al-Jazairi, this figure discussed extensively in Ahmed al-Shamsi's second book. And Massignon picks it up in the 1920s and uses it. Louis Massignon, the French Orientalist, uses it as a term to describe Abdu as this sort of Salafi. So this kind of misunderstanding enters the literature, and that's something that has been discussed by Lauzière extensively. Now, he says that this term is really... It becomes a recognizable ideological marker in the 1960s with al-Albani, particularly during his time, 1961 to 63, the University of Medina. We had an episode on Ahmed Hamda's book, so I won't kind of spend too much time discussing that. And then it really becomes very popular in the 1980s. But, why is this a question that intellectual historians have been discussing a lot? Well, because the term is bandied about and used somewhat indiscriminately to refer to widely disparate groups. I mean, already Kawthari has to point out to Ahmed Amin that actually the differences between figures like Muhammad Abdu and Ibn Abdul Wahhab are profound. I mean, they have very, very little in common. I mean, even if Abdu will occasionally appeal to the Salaf Salih and this kind of thing, it's really a rhetorical ploy. Their programs have almost nothing in common. And hopefully when Cole Bunzel's book comes out in May, I'm sure we have to have an episode on this because it's a wonderful book on classical Wahhabism. Sorry? Yeah, it's coming out in May with Princeton University Press, according to the website. So that's really important. And he, for him, the kind of label has three. It occurs in a series of three stages. This kind of pre and early 20th century use, and so on. I think I've hopefully given enough of a summary of how how Hammond understands this contribution. This is a relevant question. So Stephen, what was the author's name again? Henri Lauzière, you mean? Anyway, Stephen Connolly asks, did the late Ottoman intellectuals call themselves Salafis or Wahhabis? No. Well, the first... Hammond mentions... yes, but not systematically. So the question these historians are debating is, when does the term come into widespread use? As you can always find very occasional glancing references to it, even in pre-modern works. I mean, that's something Lauzière has done. The one coming out in May, the book coming out in May to answer this question, is by Cole Bunzel. The thesis completed at Princeton University was called Manifest Enmity. I forget what the title of the book is, but it's basically intellectual history of Wahhabism to 1930. It's fantastic, and I think
it's called Wahhabism, the History of a Militant Islamic Movement.
Yeah, so that's definitely one to look out for, inshallah. So Hammond actually, on the use of the term Salafi, Hammond actually points to, in 1920, the devout intellectual Ismail Haqi writes a work on new ilm al-kalam, yani ilmi kalam. It's kind of very important tendency in the late 19th and early 20th century, which deserves, I think, much more scholarly attention than it's received outside the Turkish context. Anyway, he actually uses in this 1920 work the terms Athari and Salafi to refer to people like Ibn Taymiyyah and Hanbalis and so on. But again, the label is not being deployed systematically in the way that it now is. You say Salafi, you think of someone like Nasiruddin al-Albani. So that's important context.
Right.
So I've discussed a bit the chapters. I've really focused on chapters 2, 3, and 4, which for me, with my particular idiosyncratic approach to Islamic intellectual history and my particular interests, are the most interesting. Right. Chapter 5 discusses their thought on the state, especially. Aqif, to some extent, is able to reconcile himself with aspects of Turkish nationalism. Although he belongs to a generation, Hammond said, that had experienced nationalism really as an attempt to displace, religious identity, even to some extent. Hassan asks if Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab attributed the term Salafi to himself or to his followers. No, I don't think there's even a single use of the term Salafi in his corpus. This is a much later, ascription. Abdu and Rida were criticized as Wahhabis and so on in their lifetime, but it's, anyway. Even King Abdulaziz was not happy with the term Wahhabi as he addresses the subject in a 1929 speech. As Cole Bunzel says in his thesis, from the 1880s, you do actually get Najdi Wahhabis who are actually fine with the label Wahhabi. They don't really have a problem with it. This is a trend that begins really late in the 19th century. And but you still find people who don't like this label, of course. So Akif is, although when Albania ceases to be part of the Ottoman Empire in 1912, and obviously he's living through the Balkan Wars, and the Ottoman Empire is just shedding territory after territory. He says something along the lines of that nationalism is a kind of, he expresses it in the language of like it's this quake which will shake Islam and so on. But during the independence struggle, he does kind of use this somewhat nationalist rhetoric. Sabri, on the other hand, never is able to reconcile. Of course, Akif is troubled by the developments in the early Republican period, and that's why he leaves. One reason why he leaves. There is speculation, and including his laicist critics who say things like, "Oh, he leaves because of the 1925 Had Law," which we discussed previously very extensively in the episode on Sevgi Adek's book. So there's speculation about what exactly proves the final straw for him. But he says when Sabri and they were in contact, when Sabri criticizes him for supporting this Turkish national struggle and so on, he says, well, I didn't have a choice. The Greeks were occupying Anatolia. And he says the changes of the early Republican period left him, Akif, so distraught that he couldn't pray without making mistakes and forgetting things, because it had really troubled him deeply on a personal level. So there's that. But I shouldn't forget Kawthari's phrase for Ataturk, طاغية الإلحاد, which I think just characterizes wonderfully this kind of perception of the early Republican regime by these exilic figures. Anyway,
how would you translate that? طاغية الإلحاد, like he is
a despot
the
of
god
atheism, or
the despot.
Ilhad is an interesting term because in the modern period, really in the 20th, maybe in the late 19th century, it comes to refer exclusively to atheism. But in earlier periods, for example, in the title of, I always forget the full title of Al-Baqillani's Kitab al-Tamhid, which mentions the word, I think, mulhid or mulhidun or something like this. Like it comes from lahad, this deviation. If you think of the grave, it has a niche in it. So it's, and the word is even وَمَنْ يَلْحَد is used in the Quran.
Yeah.
Or so it means deviation, and it is you do find it being used to refer to materialist groups, but also Ismailis, and it's generally any kind of big major religious deviation. But in the modern context, it comes to mean, and that's an interesting terminological history there, which remains to be written. But in the modern, nowadays it means basically exclusively atheism in the Arab world. So, Sabri, as I said, in 1908, I guess to engage somewhat with Stephen Connolly's question, late Ottoman intellectuals were very interested, especially in 1878 with the suspension of the...
In the interest of people knowing what the question was, let's read it out. Did the late Ottoman intellectuals grapple with democracy versus autocracy?
Very extensively. Sharif Maruddin has a book on the young Ottomans, and this was one of the major intellectual debates of the late Ottoman period, and early on after the Young Turk Revolution, 1908. I
would probably qualify it somewhat as autocracy versus constitutionalism, because democracy.
Yes, but actually, Sabri is using the term "demokratia al-Islamiyya" in the first decade of the 20th century. So he is interested in these debates. He's not unsympathetic to constitutionalism by any means. He's not reactionary in political terms. Although Niyazi Berkes refers to him as paraphrase. To the people of Niyazi Berkes in his generation, he's the kind of chief fanatic of the period. And even Akif does not escape scorn because he's the most enlightened of the bigots, as it were, the Burkes and this generation of lasers. I mean, Hammond mentions that as recently as 2017, a school in Turkey named after Sabri is vandalized because it's named after him. And even in the 1990s, you could find very critical, unscholarly critical references to Akif in the academic literature. And again, someone wedded to Ataturk's vision of the Madari is just not going to accept any aspect of this, anyway, these scholars' programs. So, yeah, and Sabri, I should say something about other works of Sabri I didn't mention. So he writes on Mas'alat Tarjamat al-Quran, where he's kind of criticizing the Turkification project, disagreeing with Mustafa al-Maraghi and Muhammad Farid Wajdi on translation. Brett Wilson has a fantastic book on this that's referenced extensively by Hammond. I think it was translating the Quran or printing the Quran in an age of nationalism, nothing like this. A wonderful book. Anyway, he writes, as I said, موقف البشر تحت سلطان الخضر, very critical of Abdu and the modernists. It explores this Orientalist critique of the period and general Western critique of Muslims as fatalist. It is also the work where, and this is responsible for their material backwardness and so on. And it really, it's the work where Sabri announces his shift from a Maturidi to an Ash'ari theological perspective on questions of Qadr. He's even critical in Mawqif al-Aql of Kawthari's position and says that Kawthari has been influenced by the ayat al-ajanib on this question and this kind of discourse of Muslims are backward because they believe in predestination or what have you. Yeah. And he's critical of, Sabri is critical of Abdu's Risalat al-Tawheed because it implies that Ash'arites are mujbira without saying so explicitly. And he says that this critique has even influenced theologically traditionalist figures like al-Muti'i. And we had an episode on Junaid Qadri's book on al-Muti'i. Right. The view that
Muti'i doesn't show up at all in this. Why is that? In this book?
He does very briefly in this context on debates about predestination, because he says that Ash'arite predestinarianism is responsible in some sense for Muslim ta'akhur, So he's internalized this critique basically, right. Which is very pervasive in this period. And Kawthari kind of says, well, why are you criticizing views that Maturidis hold on this issue? And Sabri kind of responds to him, first, Kawthari actually criticizes that work of Sabri and says this is a product of Sabri's post-exilic pessimism. It's everything is falling down around you, and you have this very sort of and all of this. I suppose it's, if you try to put yourself mentally and emotionally in the shoes of people who were, part of the Ottoman Leonid hierarchy, and then this was just torn down before their eyes, and Turkey in the 1920s is deeply authoritarian, laicist state, very, you can only imagine what they must have felt and did feel. To an extent where, Sabri mocks this kind of Turkish ethno-state and even says, this symbol of the grey wolf. This is something that no ethnic Turk, including my family, has ever heard of before you've invented it. And he even goes on to regard Arabic as afdal and afsah than the Turkish language, and says he is, in some ways, comes to identify in later life more with Arabs than Turks. Although he does complain that he cannot understand the Arabic of Egyptians, nor can they understand his. Kawthari, by the way, Hammond says, is the best Arabic of any of them. His Arabic was outstanding, although, Akif was no mean Arabist. He was really seen as the doyen of the Arabists in this period in the Turkish context, because he studied the Kamil of al-Mubarrad and these kinds of works, and he studied many other literary works privately, including Rumi's Masnavi and so on. And when he sought to coin words in Turkish, he often drew on Arabic, but his linguistic repertoire was very wide. He also used Persian and so on. So they belong to that lost world of it's kind of very deeply linguistically cosmopolitan world. That's, I mean, after the early 20th century, is just completely lost themselves. And this is even Shahab Ahmed says, my grandfather was, I think his grandfather was a doctor who spoke, he had Arabic and Persian and Urdu, and only one of his, I don't know how many grandchildren also has these, the three languages as they were known. But so Kawthari is interesting, and Sabri as well. And I should say something about... So the state, he also talks about Kutub. There's quite a lot on Kutub towards the end of the 5th chapter, and especially, I won't, rehash this because Kutub is important, but what is important to this book, especially how it's been marketed to the audience, I think it's really been misframed. I think it's a very valuable contribution, but the impression you get before you read it is that it's really about how these three figures are the ground of Islamist thought in the later 20th century. So, Sabri was really the key node of key point of contact between figures from the Muslim Brotherhood and these Turkic exiles in Egypt, these late Ottoman exiles and the emigre community in Egypt. Right. And, to the extent that Sabri, his قول الفصل في الذين يؤمنون, etc. Hassan al-Banna even suggested an alternative title for it. So they were close, and he met him a lot. Right. And Hammond even develops this point, which I really think needs more development, that the idea that we must not discount the influence of Sabri on Qutb, which is quite weakly demonstrated, to be frank. So Sabri was an admirer of Qutb even before his Islam. Now, what is the problem here? Qutb is most famous for works like Fi Dhilal al-Quran, finally published in 1961, then it comes out in a new edition by his brother in 1978. Alim fi Tariq, published in 1964. And these kinds of works. His Islamist turn, in some sense, is presaged already in the late 1940s, before he leaves to the US with the first of his Islamic works, Al-Adala al-Ijtima'iyya fil Islam, which is translated to Turkish in the 1960s. And even when he's a kind of not explicitly Islamic adib, Sabri is actually a fan of his. He likes Qutb's critical review of Abdullah al-Qasimi's Hadi al-Aghlal. These are the chains, and that's a long story, so I won't discuss the work. But he says of those who are, somewhat misguided on the Quran, Qutb is actually the best of them, and he's only unfamiliar through lack of knowledge and simple ignorance. But anyway, Al-Adala al-Ijtima'iyya, interestingly, is already saying that Egypt is no longer an Islamic realm because French law has been adopted instead of the Sharia. So already before his kind of Islamist turn in the late 40s and really in the early 50s, when he comes back and starts writing for Muslim Brotherhood periodicals, he's already anticipating, you could say, some of these own themes that become much more important in later life. Now, Hammond says that Sabri develops, or at least articulates much more explicitly this notion that, and I think this point of the book is really underdeveloped, and for me it's not clear that it's more than just a passing remark made, an offhand comment in some sense, made by Sabri, that these people who accept obedience to these laicist rulers of Turkey, in some sense this results in irtidad al-afrad, this kind of apostasy and so on. But even in Hammond's presentation of it, it's not clear exactly what he's talking about here, because he presumably would not criticize people who, live under early Republican Turkey just for the fact of living there and not openly rebelling against the government. Something he doesn't mention that Amit Bine does mention in his book, and he refers to Amit Bine, is in the bibliography. Amit Bine actually says in a period, B-E-I-N-E, Princeton PhD, it's basically on al-Ulama in the late Ottoman period and early Republican period. Wonderful book, right. Short but absolutely brilliant. Ahmed Bain actually, I'm surprised Hammond doesn't bring this up. Ahmed Bain says, Sabri actually, one point, I don't think the letter has ever responded to, and or perhaps even read. He actually writes in the 1920s to the Republican authorities and says, look, I will come back to Turkey, like, let me back and I'll stop this campaign against you in some sense, but I really want to return to Turkey. He never hears from them again. You sense his heart was broken, and tremendously traumatic for him, of course. But, in some sense, he would have, and because obviously most, the book in some sense begins with this question of, well, what happens to late Ottoman Muslim intellectuals, in the Republican period? And the book is answering the question of, well, these are the ones who go into exile, but of course the great majority of them do not. In the 6th chapter, he does discuss, Nursi has really overshadowed the entire historiography of these kinds of figures who exist. Their lives overlap the late Ottoman and early Republican, well, not even early Republican. Nursi dies in 1960, but, Sabri, on the other hand, wages what he terms a jihad ilmi against many things. He's critical, as I said, in Mawqif al-Aql of European empiricist trends and this notion that, you cannot, that reason is not, religious truths cannot be defended through pure reason. He's critical of things like works like Kant's Critique of Pure Reason and so on. But really, the whole genesis of that work, if you think about it, there's a fantastic PhD thesis by Sir Dar Poyraz on late Ottoman materialism, not referred to here, but it's really wonderful. I hope it's published. It was available on academia, so I downloaded it, but I think he went back to Turkey. He got it in, I think, the early, maybe a decade ago or a bit more than a decade ago at the Ohio State University, but it's fantastic. Serdar, Serdar, Poyraz, Poyraz, if I remember correctly. It's fantastic. Anyway, during the Hamidian period, that's when Ottoman materialism, like vulgar materialism, to use the German term, is really becomes very important. And as Shukru Heniolu says in his intellectual biography of Ataturk, this is where Ataturk comes from intellectually. So in some sense, the book is responding to this kind of trend, and obviously its program is very broad as well. It's a really impressive work in terms of range. I should probably say something about the framing of the book, because there are the odd factual errors here and there which don't really harm the book in any major way. Hammond refers to Ibn Taymiyyah as a qadi, which makes your eyes sort of pop out. It's a real howler, because obviously his life would have been dramatically different had he been part of the Mamluk, religious bureaucracy.
Quite a bit as well, I think.
Yeah, that's an very interesting, counterfactual history. What if Ibn Taymiyyah had been a qadi? But unfortunately, it wasn't to be. And as I said, I think with Sam in a previous conversation of ours, he spent a great deal of his adult life on the business end of qada, so to speak. So, but that's a fairly my feeling. I wish he'd drawn more on. It's only really important in the first chapter, Ahmed Dalal's book. On the 18th century, because some points that Hammond makes, drawn on Haeckel, for example, when he talks about Shawkani's discussion of the 1798 Napoleonic invasion, and these are treated much better in Dalal's book. And some of the weaknesses in the first chapter, for instance, where he compares Shah Waliullah and Shawkani's views on taqlid, which is not very well done. It's just a passing comment, so it's not something I dwell on, but Dalal actually does a much better job of explicating the programmatic differences between figures like Shawkani. The emphasis of the book is the contrast between Ibn Abdul Wahhab and everyone else, but he does discuss the program of Shah Waliullah and Shawkani. Shawkani, a fascinating figure, of course. Ahmed al-Shamsi has a wonderful discussion of him in his second book on print culture. But so again, to say something a bit more about the final chapter, Osama.
Sure.
Sorry, the problem of framing. So the book, before you read it, has been sold to us in some sense, as I said, this establishes a link between late Ottoman figures and Islamists. I don't actually regard that as the main contribution of the book in any sense. It features a bit in chapter 5 and also in chapter 6, not really much elsewhere in the book. And I think it's also, it's not very well argued, if I may say so, which is not really a problem unless you insist on regarding the book as exploring this connection. Why? And there are many ways to demonstrate this. So, for example, like, as Hammond clearly recognizes, Sabri and especially Kothari, these were late Sunni traditionalists. Their intellectual, even if Sabri hung out with Benna and so on, like, their intellectual agendas have almost nothing in common with Qutb and Benna and so on. Now, this point about, life as a Muslim in post-Sharia society, okay, it's mentioned by Sabri, but, he's defending Kalam. That's a major preoccupation of Mawqif al-Aql.
Right.
Kothari is polemicizing against Wahhabis and Salafis and so on. I mean, Hassan al-Banna had zero interest in polemics, right? Even though in a 1930s statement of purpose, he referred to the Ikhwan's call as a da'wah salafiyya, but not in the sense we would understand that term, Hassan al-Banna.
But again, even that, I mean, it's
and what does that mean in that period? Not
right?
Exactly. So, I mean,
statement.
Hassan al-Banna, I don't even know if he commented much on Shi'ism. I guess it's not really relevant in the Egyptian context, but he was very ecumenical, very accommodating, this kind of big tent Sunnism, and he didn't regard any of that stuff as the priority. Kothari lived and died by these kind of polemical battles. In his view, he was defending the purity of Sunnism as he understands it, theologically and legally, against modernist and purist Salafis. I mean, he doesn't really talk about Abdu much, and he's mostly critical of him for his legal views. He's much less harsh on Abdu than Sabri is. But these are his people he's preoccupied with. For example, as features in a number of his maqalat and is discussed briefly by Hammond. In 1939, Muhammad Hamid al-Fiqhi, the head of the Ansar al-Sunnah Muhammadiyya, publishes, and Azharite committee is initially very critical of this, but it does pass muster in the end, and it is published, the work of Uthman bin Sa'id al-Darimi, his work against Bishr al-Marisi. So Kothari writes a lot about this. He's very unhappy it gets published. He regards it as a work of pure tajsim or anthropomorphism. And, he polemicizes against, he says, Ibn Taymiyyah, he got these ideas from his non-Muslims whom he grew up amongst, which is a bizarre claim. Muhibbuddin al-Khatib implies that there's a kind of anti-Arab prejudice in Kothari's work. And Kothari has this interesting response in 1929 where he sets out who his main kind of enemies are, and they are people like Ibn Taymiyyah, who already early in his career he'd identified Ibn Taymiyyah as a focal point for many of these criticisms, whether it's against the cult of saints or on so-called anthropomorphism and so on. So, I mean, Benna has zero interest in. I mean, he might be interested on an abstract level, but like in terms of his activism and what he speaks about and what he agitates about. Nothing in common. Even Qutb. I mean, where is late Sunni traditionalism in the? And I'm not talking about marginal aspects of the, the career and the intellectual production of figures like Kothari edited he spent his exile editing texts and polemicizing. I mean, if you read his maqalat, it's basically a series of polemics for the most part. I mean. That has nothing at all to do with the Islamism of figures like.
There are interesting connections that are alluded to in the.
I mean, there are connections, but you can't say late Ottoman origins. I mean, you can't speak of origins. So, I mean, for instance, Aaron Rock-Singer has pointed out that already in the 1920s, Ansar al-Sunnah al-Muhammadiyya were routinely using this label of Jahiliyyah to describe certain aspects of modern society. So, I mean, Hammond discusses how Qutb meets Abu Hassan Ali Nadwi in Mecca on Hajj in 1950, and then through him he becomes familiar with the works of Mawdudi, and he writes prefaces to some works he writes a preface to a work of Nadwi and so on. And there is a discussion of Hakimiyya, which I know is dear to your heart because you wrote an article that appeared in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society about it. So perhaps I should say that. So he takes issue with the claim that Hakimiyya first appears as a translation of a term used by Maududi in an essay of Maududi. However, that is how Qutb seemingly becomes aware of the term Hakimiyya. But Hammond finds, for instance, a Turkish dictionary published in 1899 that uses the word Hakimiyya to translate the French for sovereignty. Now,
I mean,
so that's one issue with the book.
Yeah, Zaman has established that the term was, it predates Maududi. In South Asia.
Yeah, but I mean, for me, this whole debate about Hakimiyya is, كلمة حق تراد بها باطل, so to speak. It's
Go ahead.
يراد بها باطل. It's why? Because okay, you're overly fixated on terminology when what should really matter is the underlying meaning. I mean, I can't believe Michael Cook would accept such almost myopic claims, focus on this importance of this Hakimiyya and all of this. I mean, okay, it's interesting for intellectual historians to track the evolution of terms, and I do that myself, but
Hodgson once described sort of intellectual history as basically that, as far as I remember.
Yeah, I mean, but I think content matters at least as much and really more than the terminology in some sense. So, are cognate ideas being expressed using different terminology? And obviously, the answer is yes. Now, of course, it has different kind of elements and resonances in the modern period, and I would grant Hammond that. Now, one other gripe. So the book has been, I think, seriously misframed and also mismarketed, and that's the publisher's fault. They want a book that will sell. Let's make it sexy. Late Sunni traditionalist debates are not very sexy. Islamism is sexy. Okay, so that's the fault of the publishers. So no blame on that. But I mean, the whole thing about Islamism, which is obviously important to the book, and I even wrote down. So, how is Islamism defined? So in the first chapter, which I didn't really have an opportunity to discuss, so he does talk about the genesis of the term Islamism. In the Ottoman, the Turkish for which is, what is it, Islam Lasmak or something like this. So it's first used in 1904 by the Tatar intellectual Yusuf Aktsura in the Cairo-based journal Turk, and it really emerges as well in the debates in the late Ottoman context between people like Ziya Gökalp, who has no problem with warm fellow feelings for other Muslims, but has in a 1913 piece he discusses problems with the sort of pan-Islamist with the political dimensions of the project, I should say. Kind of an odd thing to say when the Ottomans are still in 1913 ruling over parts of North Africa, but anyway. Well, I mean, they lose Libya. Libya's invaded in 1912, but I mean, they're still ruling over the Arab provinces in Levant and so on. So how is... And so, in the debate between figures like Ziya Gökalp and others, I mean, Said Halim Pasha, the former prime minister, in 1918 releases a book which is kind of one of these attempts to ideologize Islam. It's an all-encompassing system of life and this kind of notion. But the debate between Ziya Gökalp and others, results in this is kind of where the terminology becomes more prominent, or if we can't say it's coined in this period, at least we can say that. So how is Islamism defined? And as I said, I wrote it down so I would be able to cite it on page 23 by Hammond, I believe. So Islamism is, quote, or at least as understood by Ziya Gökalp, an identitarian understanding of the state as a transnational representative of Muslims. So you have a few elements there. Understanding of the state as a transnational representative of Muslims with obligations beyond its borders that transcended race and language. He also speaks extensively of this ideologization of Islam as a development that takes place in the late Ottoman period and is transmitted by these Cairene intellectuals and then returns to Turkey when their students and so on go back to Turkey. Ideologization is taking reified religion beyond the realms of law and theology into the political. Now, I mean, where do I start? And this, I should say, it's not so much a criticism of Hammond as it is a scholarship on the phenomenon referred to as Islamism. So this is a symptom of a kind of broader malaise, if you like. Now, and so on. Now, I just gave you this definition of Islamism.
Briefly interrupt you and
Sure.
just, I mean, my recollection, and again, it's been a couple of days since I read chapter 1, and I read it a bit fast, but my recollection is that like there is a consciousness of the Eurocentrism of our categories, right? I mean, the fact that religion, as we understand today, is anachronistic if used as a historical category of analysis.
Yeah, which of course we've mentioned this critique of this notion.
I mean, but I got the sense that was there in chapter 1. So I mean, to be honest, as you were reading that section, I only sort of recalled glimmers of it. So I wasn't obviously paying close enough attention. But that's really interesting. And as you say, it's a problem. With
so why is this a problem? I actually went up while reading the book, some time ago. I went and looked up Juwayni and his Irshad إلى قواطع الأدلة في أصول الاعتقاد, this theological handbook, which received many commentaries. So okay, Islamism is what did I say? This basically this particular understanding of the state, and it has obligations beyond its borders that transcend race and language and so on. I mean, in his Irshad, which has been translated by Paul Walker, I should say, has a discussion of this point about whether it's permissible to have one Muslim imam, like ruler in the whole world. شخصين في طرف العالم is I looked up the terminology he uses. He says yes, it is, but his Asharite peers, Ashabuna, disagree. And in the commentary on this passage, Ibn Maymun says, just as it is, the idea the other Asharites are defending is just as it is, unlawful for a bride to have more than one husband, it is unlawful for the, you could say the bride that is the Ummah to have more than one bridegroom, the caliph. I mean, how could anyone? I mean, like if I think about who's more political, I mean, is Juwayni an Islamist? If that term is anachronistic, can you give me I want to say that. If that term is anachronistic, well, give me a good explanation of why it's anachronistic. Give me a real meaningful definition of Islamism. Okay, so the idea of, firstly, Islamists aren't the only ones reifying Islam in the early 20th century, even late Sunni traditionalists.
Briefly and just say that, like, the word Islamist is so problematic. I absolutely agree with you that it's always in my sort of course on Islam and politics. The first week is always the question, what the heck is Islamism, right?
Yeah.
And I'm asking people try and come up with some kind of workable definition.
I haven't seen a good definition, like even a workable definition.
I mean, what I end up, this is kind of my...
And Hammond has obviously spent many years, writing about Islamism and thinking about it, so...
But the thing is, this is what I tell students, that look, Islamism is such a slippery term. For each piece of writing that you're doing, sets parameters of what you mean by the term, rather than think you can actually develop a conceptual framework that's going to be useful beyond this particular space or this particular moment in history or something like that. I mean, you've read Salman Sayyid, perhaps?
No, I still haven't. Somewhat embarrassing.
No, it's a very different kind of, it's not intellectual history, so to speak, so I'm not too surprised. But like, he defines an Islamist as someone who, centers their politics on Islam in some way, takes Islam as the central reference point for their politics. Now, you can do that, but like, that's an interesting definition. I think it works for him, but I always will say that is Salman Sayyid's definition of Islamism. I cannot find a consistent use of Islamism across the field. It just doesn't exist.
It becomes like a counter definition in the sense that, when you can only define something by adducing examples of it, your exercise of defining has just failed utterly. When you can only define a tree by pointing to trees and saying that's one of them, then because when Rousseau writes about the origins of language, he says you start from this level where everything is individual objects, and then your mind is the human's able to abstract them into this kind of meta level, and then language emerges. And like if you it's like the discussion of Islamism just hasn't reached this level of abstraction yet, and it's kind of rudimentary. I should say that because I obviously it's all spontaneous and unscripted. It's كلمة حق يراد بها باطل, of course. But anyway, that's a minor point. So. No, I mean, I'm not, Stephen is asking, so the Prophet ﷺ was an Islamist. I mean, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, give me a decent definition of this, thing that, because, classical Islamic religious culture is obviously very deeply invested in the quest for definition, right? I mean, any discussion will begin with the definition, of a discipline. It will begin with the definition of discipline. And there's an idea that, definitions should be all-inclusive and all-exclusive. So jami' and mani', it should include all the elements it needs to include and exclude everything that is excluded. Concision is wonderful. Now, that in the case of Islam, that just fails. I mean, in this book, but also in the discipline more broadly. I mean, if it's the notion, this idea of reified religion, what does Hammond say about it? That, it extends, ideologization is this kind of reified religion extended beyond the domain of law and theology to include things like politics. Well, how is law not deeply political? I mean, in the first place, it doesn't make any sense.
What's the statement that Ghazali quotes in the Ihya? Ad-Din was Sultan al-Aman.
Yeah, twins. And this is, a Sasanian, an idea that's around in the Sasanian context. I can't make sense of it. I mean, and as we discussed with Sam, I mean, the best polling data we have from reputable organizations like Pew suggests that, in contexts like Egypt and Pakistan and
they say explicitly,
and so on,
we want the Sharia should be the source of the law, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not only that, which, Muslims broadly will agree on, but when asked about specifics, stoning adulterer, executing apostates, like the great majority of Muslims, according to this Pew, reputable polling data by Pew, and in contexts like Egypt and so on, of course, much less so in post-Soviet nations and so on. Like the great majority in contexts like Egypt and so on agree to this. I mean, does that mean the great majority of Muslims in Egypt is like Islamists? As we said somewhat humorously when we were thinking through this last night, I mean, how, according to these definitions of Islamism, Abdul Fattah al-Sisi is an Islamist? I mean, because...
this is actually a conversation I had with David Kirkpatrick of the New York Times in the back of an Uber as we were both going to an event. We were supposed to attend an event where Recep Tayyip Erdogan was going to be there in London. But we couldn't make it. So we just had a nice evening having a long conversation. And so David basically, as we were discussing it, I was saying, look, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is instrumentalizing religion for his political purposes. He's ideologizing.
By the way, I don't even think he's necessarily even insincere in how he's using religion.
Yeah, I don't think he's insincere. I mean, like...
and what was it when he was... He had this, we talked about this, he wrote a thesis of some kind when he was on the US undergoing advanced training as an officer. And his thesis...
Army War College,
Army War College. I mean, it's a statement of like the purest possible Islamism that, we cannot abstract. I mean, it's... so the category Islamist, I mean, it's a bit like the word fundamentalist. I can imagine ways in which it might be analytically useful. But because 99.5% of the time it's not used, deployed, defined correctly, in practice it's no longer useful. So a fundamentalist, I would say, is someone who believes in, return to scripture and entirely omitting reference to the scholarly edifice and tradition and so on. That, I think that's a useful definition of a fundamentalist. But whether even in scholarly discourse, a fundamentalist is basically anyone slightly conservative who disagrees with Western liberalism. So it's lost any analytic value it had as a terminology in Islamic studies. And the same is true of the word Islamist, I would argue. I mean, you can't, a definition is not to point at the AKP and say that's an Islamist, and then at the Muslim Brotherhood and say, that's not a definition. That's just a complete.
I mean, so in defense of this is the challenge with using any analytical category, because
Yeah.
the term religion, what does that even refer to? It's highly
Yeah,
disagreed
but
upon, right?
I mean,
And
what I would
and
warn
so
against, yeah. So there's a difference between my dissatisfaction with the term Islamist as an
which I've written
analytical
about my
category.
dissatisfaction with it as
Yeah.
well, so I don't disagree with you.
And you know,
But I use it because it's used widely in scholarship. I mean,
yeah. So it's
you're
hard to
kind of
evade
between a
these
rock and a hard
kinds
place.
of- Exactly. Exactly. I mean, I should say in the 6th chapter, Hammond does discuss some of the kind of networks, you know, what happens to Turkish Muslim intellectuals in the early Republican period. He talks about Erbakan and so on. So from 1970 and then 1972, when he kind of reformulates his party. I'm interested, you know, he's actually, by the way, Erbakan, Hammond says, enters politics on the urging of his Khalidi Naqshbandi Sheikh.
Right.
Which is interesting. And Akif's father was a Khalidi Naqshbandi. I mean, Walid Ziyad has this wonderful book on this particular, the Mujaddidi. Mujaddidis are kind of the parent suborder, and then the Khalidis come from them anyway. That's Walid with a double E. The Hidden Caliphate. It's a really interesting, wide-ranging, ambitious work. But I don't think we'll have an episode on it because Sufism isn't something I research. So in 1988, there's a kind of committee established to coordinate between these key Islamist parties. Yeah, I'm using the term because it's impossible to avoid. The Muslim Brotherhood and Erbakan's movement in Malaysia, those in Southeast Asia, and the MB agree not to recruit in domains where other parties are operating, in other countries where they're operating. And you know, some of the figures who were I mean, he says it's very interesting because in the Arab world there is much more of a cleavage than in the Turkish context between, you know, whom we would call figures we would call Islamists and ulama. So of course Abu Ghudda was a major figure in the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood and a major ulama and the student of Kawthari. Right. In the Turkish context, these cleavages are much less pronounced. So he points out that Kawthari and Sabri's students really the ones who introduce, you know, Qutub's في ظلال القرآن and العدالة الاجتماعية translated into Turkish in the 60s. And really, Qutub and other major Islamist figures introduced to Turkey by students of people like Kawthari and Sabri. There's one Mustafa Ranyan, I forget his name, who dies in 1988, who is a preacher in an Istanbul mosque and even has a slot in a program in Ankara radio, the state radio station. And from the late 1940s, the Islamist and Muslim publishing scene is really flourishing in Turkey. And of course, it emerges even more strongly after 1950 and the success of the Democratic Party under Adnan Menderes. And Erbakan, interestingly, urges the Ikhwan to participate more in electoral politics, something that takes them a long time to start doing in a sustained way. But yeah, so, and the book is, I think, is very important. Yes, this is another, commentator, Sheikh Amin Siraj, who passed away, rahimahullah, recently, if I'm not mistaken, was the one who pioneered the translation of Qutb. So you have a figure who's really defending the late Sunni traditionalist viewpoint.
Right.
And you know, undertaking a translation of Fi Dhil al-Quran, a large multi-volume work, is not something one does flippantly or, you know, without serious. It's a major undertaking. Right. So that's interesting. I mean, yeah. But this attempt again, to really. Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
But this attempt again to ground, which I think is missold as the centerpiece of the book, to ground Islamist thought in late Ottoman intellectuals, you know, based on a passing remark of Sabri and the fact that he hung out with Hassan al-Banna in Egypt. I mean, this is somewhat, and it's not just that I don't think it's executed well in the book. I don't think it can be done, because, you know, it's apples and oranges in the sense that, you know, look at what Kawthari wrote, look at what Sabri wrote, and then compare that to what Hassan al-Banna did. And, you know, Hassan al-Banna has, I mean, I think it would be much easier to establish, as people have done, not only a contact but intellectual genealogy between Rashid Rida and Muhammad Abdu and Hassan al-Banna and modern Islamists. Much easier to do that, and that's very plausible. I just don't think that's done well in the book, and because of the way the book is framed, it does a disservice to what I think is a really important contribution. And what do I see as the main contribution of this book? It's really a nice, properly contextualized, well-informed by secondary scholarship, including in Turkish, series of intellectual biographies of three major late Ottoman figures who survive into the Republican period. And Stephen Connolly, I do want to address this. He says that I don't get a feel for whether late Ottoman intellectuals tackled any of the major intellectual challenges regarding modernity facing the Ottomans. I mean, my answer to that would be the Mawqif al-Aql of Sabri, which is really the key work of his that Hammond engages, is really a response to the philosophical challenges of modernity. It's a very kind of intellectually sophisticated work. And it's a response to the materialism of the late Ottoman Empire and to empiricism and so on, and the kind of conviction that Western philosophers reached, that we cannot demonstrate religion rationally. This sort of perspective, which he argues Abdu has conceded too much ground to. Kawthari is really mired in intra-Islamic polemics and is not really interested in addressing the West almost at all.
Right.
And I mean, Akif is, primarily remembered as a poet, and his response to modernity, the person he has the greatest sympathy for is Muhammad Abdu, so his response to modernity to a great extent resembles Abdu, whom we translated extensively. But yeah, so I think it's a really important book.
Right.
I think the most important chapters of the book are chapter 2 to 5. Yeah. I think this kind of connection to Islamism is almost an afterthought, and it's not very successfully executed. Not because I think Hammond has made a major contribution here. I just don't think the argument holds much water. Yeah. And finally, Yahya Haidar, whose thesis we're very fond of, says Sheikh Amin Siraj was a student of Kawthari. So I think he was the last student of Kawthari's to die, if I'm not mistaken. He was the last of Kawthari. So, and also influenced by the late, although I know very little about him, the late Sunni traditionalist trend is the late, this very influential Naqshbandi Sheikh. He was in this Muslim 500, what's his name? His community were in the Ismail Agha neighborhood of Istanbul.
I know who you're talking about, but I completely
Mehmed or Muhammad or the name escapes me, but
right.
But yeah, so I really like the book. Yes, Mahmoud Effendi, this is it. Thank you for reminding us. He was really influential, and he was a product of. He wasn't alive during the Ottoman Caliphate, but he was a product of the intellectual culture that kind of survived. And Hammond says, in some sense, the Republican project was not, if it's too much to say that it failed, it certainly didn't fully succeed in its aims, because religiously it was not able to penetrate the Anatolian sort of hinterland. It's a sort of return of the repressed, if you like, that came back to bite the Republican in the arse, as it were. But so is his proper name Mahmoud Ustaz Osmanoglu. Sorry for butchering the pronunciation, but yeah, Osama, to go back to you.
No, I was just saying, Jazakallah khairan. This has been very wide-ranging, and I hope it's been quite. Thank you for the audience members for engaging quite a bit.
Yeah.
Because you put in quite a lot of questions or queries or comments.
Yeah. Hopefully, I've addressed them all more or less. I hope. But yeah, thank you for your engagement and for listening. Of course, as we always say, our disclaimer. Do not listen while operating heavy machinery or driving. But thank you for your engagement. I really appreciate it.
There are some stray questions. I think they didn't.
All right.
Quite
Could we perhaps mop them up quickly?
Stephen Connolly says, are you saying that people holding on to predestination as a concept were prone to normalizing the corruption of the Ottoman system? This was in the discussion of...
Yeah, so no, what I'm saying is that there was a very pervasive critique in the 19th and 20th centuries, much less prominent now, I think. You still find traces of it here and there. That was to some extent internalized, particularly by reformist figures such as Muhammad Abdu, that Muslims believe in predestination, divine determination of fate, and therefore they're backwards because they're not active and they're passive, and this kind of motif. I mean, even some people have written about this, that in I don't know if it was Auschwitz or perhaps one of the other Holocaust death camps, that you had this notion even developed, this terminology among Jewish occupants of these camps of the Musliman. Why they would use this to refer to people who are very sort of passive and accepting of their obviously horrible fate. And there's been some discussion of this. I can't remember where I saw it or heard it discussed. But that trope was very pervasive in European intellectual life, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Now it's and yeah, I mean, even somewhat traditionalists like Muti'i were saying that yes, Ash'arite views on Qadr are responsible for Muslim backwardness and ta'akhur. Like it really penetrated, so it really Muslims did really deeply internalize this critique. And I mean, nowadays it doesn't really make a great deal of sense. I mean, for anyone, I think. I mean. Would someone make this?
I mean, it doesn't. It just doesn't have currency, I would say. I mean,
yeah, but
in that sense,
I mean, it's a bit like this whole taqlid ijtihad debate. Muslims adopted taqlid, and therefore they decayed intellectually. I mean, however much you concede that, I mean, you can very easily say, well, what about Shiite jurists? Why was there no difference in the material conditions of the Shi'i houses of Iraq and so on, vis-a-vis the Sunni? So that school adherence was more important. I mean, this idea that somehow you can explain an entire complex, sociologically, exacting, in terms of explanation, picture and history and everything with a single theological category. I mean, any historian should tear their hair out at this, but nonetheless, and Hammond mentions that, for Hegel and Guizot, this idea of Muslim society is static, and right. It was very much there. So even people like Hegel and so on, who didn't really, they weren't Islamicists, they weren't Orientalists reading the language, but even to them, this image was very, something they couldn't avoid. So, yeah.
I mean, I think there are some very fundamental sort of urges in, among human beings that cause them to...
I mean, I understand the need for narrative, right? And human beings are creatures of narrative, and you can't really make sense of, facts. But, there's a difference between responsible narratives and, especially as historians, intellectual historians, right. Responsible historical narratives, and others that are just, I mean, especially in the 19th and 20th century, I mean, these are basically racist. I mean, and, even explicitly, when something I didn't mention...
Can I interject briefly?
So I just want to finish this point before I forget it, very briefly. So, unlike Sabri, Akif does not discuss really the debate between Abdu and Renan. Right. He focuses on the debate between Abdu and Gabriel Hanato. Right. And Hanato is like explicitly characterizing in Islam in racialist terms as this sort of Semitic religion that will trouble the French Empire and so on. I mean, that was the context we're dealing of, where Islam was this Semitic religion, and I mean, a friend reminded me, you even find a touch of this in Hagerism, actually. This racialization of Islam and this reductionism, as Stephen Connolly says.
40 years ago, of course.
Yeah.
Oh, about 40 years. Yeah.
I mean, but in some weird sense, although Fazl Rahman was active in the 60s and especially the 70s onwards, Muslims were not interlocutors of Western scholarship on Islam
Right.
really until, I mean, the 80s, the 90s. Well, I mean, Muslims entering the
Yeah,
Western Academy in large numbers, that's really the
Yeah.
2000s.
Yeah.
But, you know, Hegel and
Incidentally, I
Beinfeld
have
also.
my children might
All
make
right.
might jump in at some point. So please.
All right.
Bear with
Yeah,
me.
I think I've said what I need to say in the episode. It's the longest we've had so far at nearly 2 hours.
I think we've done. I think we may have beaten it in the past. Yeah.
Oh, with
Sorry,
this.
my son is wanting some attention, so
Oh.
I'm just going to give him some.
Hi, Bob.
Mama folded the house all the time.
Okay. So I'm gonna inshallah manage my son briefly, and
Yep.
inshallah, Omar, just briefly, do you
Yeah.
mind giving us an idea of what we can expect in the coming weeks and months?
Yes, so we will have a break for the holidays. Of course, I'm going back to see my parents in London, and I will be preparing some of our future episodes during the break. No rest for the wicked, as it were, but it's very cute. So yes, our next episode, however, long delayed, and I apologize for the delay. Sometime in January, I hope, perhaps in early February, because we have various deadlines and commitments in mid and late January that have to be attended to. But our next episode will be on Aaron Rocksinger's book, In the Shade of the Sunnah, which I think is a wonderfully important book, and dovetails quite interestingly with this one. In fact, the subtitle of which is, so In the Shade of the Sunnah, Salafi Piety, something. Remind me, Osama?
Sorry, just give me 1 second. I actually have it.
Which I had the honor of,
Salafi piety in the 20th century Middle East.
Yes. Yeah, and Aaron is, I mean, he's really one of the bright stars of our generation, very prolific and important scholar.
Right.
And the book is really important. And if you're interested in the intellectual history of, Egypt, of Islamism, of any of these things, I mean, Aaron is really an authority. So I look forward to that episode, inshallah.
Looking forward to it as well. But I guess finally, Jazakumullah khairan, Omar, it's really always wonderful to get your very considered and erudite thoughts on Islamic intellectual history, whenever it may be. We're doing sort of modern in this session, but we've done, of course, a wide range of periods in the past and various dimensions. So inshallah, I just wanted to thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
I also wanted to thank our viewers for spending so much time with us, and hopefully this was an educational experience or edifying on some level. And we look forward to welcoming you back in a few weeks' time. Please bear with us if we take a little longer than
I mean, on our Twitter page, we will announce any updates, and once we have a schedule as well.
If there are any sort of delays in those sorts of updates, then it is very much my fault rather than Omar's. So,
well,
so
you have a family. I mean, of your own young children and so on.
Alhamdulillah, there's never a dull moment in this household.
Yeah.
All right. So
anyway, and thank you, of course, to Andrew Hammond for making this wonderfully important contribution to the field.
Oddly enough, because COVID and so on, I've still not met Andrew. We've only ever had meetings. We've only ever had virtual meetings. So, and he's, Andrew, I meet on an annual basis for the last couple of years while we're doing interviews for undergraduates coming into Oxford. So I saw him actually just a few weeks ago, or a couple of weeks ago probably. I guess thanks to Andrew for sort of putting the time in for what I think is a fascinating and groundbreaking work on so many levels. Notwithstanding sort of our perhaps, I haven't read chapter 5 and 6 yet, but disagreements with sort of causation.
Aspects of the book and its framing.
Aspects of chapter 5 and 6. But otherwise, just fantastic. I mean, people who I think are fantastically important, but who have just been ignored, unfortunately, in the literature so far, which is another, perennial reminder of how much there is to be done in our field, which is always very promising for scholars as well. Barakallahu fikum, Omar. Inshallah, I will see you in a few weeks' time.
All right, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.